In this video, we're going to talk about plants that produce seeds and their evolution. In a previous lesson, you learned about seedless plants, and this included non-vascular and vascular seedless plants. So seedless plants can be non-vascular or vascular. A few other characteristics of the seedless plants that you've already learned about is that they require water for reproduction, and that's because the male gamete has to be able to swim to the female gamete. And remember that gametes are just the sex cells, and so this is needed for sexual reproduction. Most seedless plants are homosporous, meaning that they only produce one type of spore. And the gametophyte part of the plant does not have to be connected to the sporophyte part of the plant. Remember, this has to do with kind of the two different parts of a plant's life cycle during the alternation of generations. So now let's take a look at seed plants and kind of compare and contrast the differences with seedless plants. First of all, seed plants, all of them are vascular. So they all have that vascular tissue, which consists of the xylem and phloem. Another key difference between seeded plants and seedless plants is that seed plants do not require water for sexual reproduction. Instead, these plants produce a substance known as pollen, and pollen contains the male gamete. And this pollen can be carried by wind, pollinators like bees, animals. It can hitch a ride on their fur. It can also be transported by water, but it's not required to be transported by water. All plants that produce seeds are heterosporous. Hetero means different or other, and that just means that these plants produce two different types of spores. They produce microspores, which are the male spores. These spores develop into a male gametophyte, which produces the sperm that's going to be in the pollen grains. The female structures are known as megaspores. They develop into the female gametophyte and ultimately develop eggs, which are the female gamete. And in plants that produce seeds, the gametophyte and the sporophyte have to coexist within the same plant, because the gametophyte requires support from the sporophyte to get water and nutrients. I also skipped over the most obvious difference, which is that seed plants produce seeds, and seedless plants do not. And we'll talk more about what a seed is later in this lesson. So let's take a look at the evolution timeline of plants. So remember, we've already talked about seedless plants in a previous lesson, and the seedless non-vascular plants probably arose about 500 million years ago. So MYA, remember, stands for millions of years ago. And some examples that we talked about are the bryophytes, which included the liverworts, hornworts, and true mosses. About 75 million years later, which is about 425 million years ago from today, the first seedless vascular plants showed up. And the examples that we've talked about include the club mosses, horsetails, whisk ferns, and true ferns. About 25 million years later, about 400 million years ago from today, the first seed-producing vascular plants arose, and these are known as the gymnosperms. And then a long time later, so about 125 million years ago from today, the first flowering, seed-producing vascular plants arose, and these are known as angiosperms. And in this lesson, we're going to be focusing on the seed-producing plants, and then we'll talk a little bit more about the gymnosperms and angiosperms in more detail.